Anyway, welcome everyone for this talk that is organized by the Reactionary Politics Research Network. The talk has been generously funded by the University of West of England and the University of Bath, and allowing us to bring Jean Beaman to the southwest of the UK, which is a great pleasure to welcome Jean here. Before I talk about Jean, because this is what we all here for, I'd like to say just a few words about Jean's talk, really, and how it echoes a lot of what we're doing in the RPRN, but also a lot of what we should be focusing on as scholars more broadly, and things that we were talking about with Jean earlier on about how difficult it is today to kind of, think about doing research, think about writing for think about writing for journals. Well, the world is, the way it is. So it's not for us not to think, of course, about the genocide that's taking place in Gaza, which has taken a darker turn today again, and just seeing many academics remaining silent on what's happening, not just to our colleagues there, but also to people on the ground day in, day out. It's hard not to think also of those colleagues who suffer in other countries, such as the US, Germany, and many other countries when they speak up against injustice. And finally, it's hard not to think about the resurgence of reactionary politics more widely and the impact it has on many communities and democracy more widely. So today we're pleased that we can still organize these kind of talks, and that you could leave the US to join us as well, which I know is not easy for everyone at the moment. And yeah, we're very, very pleased to have you talk about something that is obviously incredibly important and incredibly linked to all these things I've talked about, which is your brilliant concept of suspect citizenship that has been kind of core to your research, and but is really, really important today, as it was when you started kind of developing it. So a bit of an introduction for Jean, although I'm sure many of you know who Jean is. Jean is Associate Professor of Sociology in the PhD program at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and on leave from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research is ethnographic in nature and focuses on ethnicity, race and ethnicity, racism, international migration, and state violence in both France and the United States. She is author of Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, that was published by the University of California Press in 2017, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. She is also an associate editor of the journal Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, and a corresponding editor for the journal Métropolitique. She was a 2022-23 fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and a co-PI for the Mellon Foundation's Sawyer Seminar Grant, Race, Precarity, and Privilege Migration in a Global Context for 2020-2022. And I think it's missing in your biography is that you're also now one of the co-editors of Ethnic and Racial Studies.
No, I'm on the editorial board.
Editorial, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Editorial, which is also amazing because that's also why you're here, so that's great. Yeah. Anyway, without further ado, the floor is yours. Jean's going to speak to us for about 40-45 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for questions. So obviously, keep them in mind. If you're online, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll keep an eye on it and make sure that I ask them to Jean at the end. So yeah, Jean, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you to the network for co-sponsoring this. Thank you to Henrik and Aurelian for all the arrangements to make this happen, and it's lovely to meet so many people in person that I've only met or exchanged with online and Zoom or emails and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to dive right in. So the title of my lecture is Suspect Citizenship, Rethinking Belonging and Non-Belonging in Plural Societies, which comes from the book that I'm currently very much in the midst of writing, so I'm happy to share parts of it with you today and hopefully get your feedback. So just to give a bit of a preamble, I'm a scholar and ethnographer of race, racism, and migration in France. And I've often been asked how I came to this topic, partly because I'm an American. And while that's a bit of a long story, I want to partly address that by starting this talk with James Baldwin, the late African-American intellectual and writer and expat to Paris, and how his reflections about race and belonging in France as an African-American have been so influential to me. So in 1972, in No Name in the Street, he wrote, quote, "Life in Paris was to some extent protected by the fact that I carried a green passport," which was the color of US passports. I don't know. I didn't know that at the time, but anyway. This passport proclaimed that I was a free citizen of a free country and was not therefore to be treated as one of Europe's uncivilized Black possessions, end quote. So what Baldwin beautifully illustrates in his overall writing is how his status as a Black American in Paris simultaneously allowed him to witness cruelties towards France's ethnoracial minorities, and realized the status afforded to him as a US citizen in Paris. Baldwin's insights and observations have resonated with me years later as I was conducting my own fieldwork in France, and they connect to what I'm going to share with you today. Thinking through how France, as part of Europe, treats its quote-unquote undesirable populations, and how I think this speaks to how we should understand belonging and non-belonging in a post-colonial and plural societies. So I'm interested here in how the state produces non-belonging and makes people feel out of place, including through, as I'll talk about shortly, state violence. So on October 27, 2005, almost 20 years ago, Saïd Bena, a 17-year-old of Tunisian origin, and Beno Traoré, a 15-year-old of Malayan origin, pictured here, were electrocuted at a substation as they fled police in the Parisian banlieue or suburban outskirts of Cité-sous-Bois. They are allegedly trying to avoid an identity check or a contrôle d'identité. Under current laws, police officers have justification to stop individuals seen as quote-unquote suspicious, ask for their identification and whereabouts, and comb through their belongings. Such identity checks have often led to harassment and brutality by the police, including death. So therefore, in running for their lives, Saïd and Beno also ran towards their deaths. Outrage about their deaths and the lack of acknowledgement thereof by the police led to uprisings throughout France's banlieues for a few weeks. National and international media heavily covered these uprisings, featuring lots of images of heavily armed police and cars and buildings on fire. Then President Jacques Chirac declared a state of emergency. And then Interior Minister and later President Nicolas Sarkozy called the individuals involved in the uprisings racailles or scum and suggested cleaning the streets of the banlieues with the brand of a high-pressure water hose. The police officers involved in the deaths of Saïd and Beno were cleared of all charges related to their deaths over a decade later. So at the time of these uprisings, which when I was in graduate school, the popular discourse was that the disaffected, unemployed, and underemployed youth involved in these uprisings needed to better integrate themselves into French society. This includes youth like Saïd and Beno, who are framed as migrants rather than as French-born citizens. They were the problem, not the state of France itself. While these uprisings received much national and international media attention, what was often missed in the discourse at the time was the role of police violence or state violence in creating a context for the deaths of these two ethno-racial minority youth and the subsequent uprisings. Is the volume okay? Speak louder, so okay. So I argue that Saïd and Beno were fleeing the police because of the suspect citizenship to which they've been assigned. They are framed as suspects and not as full citizens or members of society. The state, through the police, among other institutions, renders certain populations as automatically and necessarily suspect or suspicious because of their ethno-racial assignment. And I say necessary in reference to the work they do for the state, as I'll elaborate upon shortly. So the lives and deaths of Saïd and Beno reveal how plural societies operate. Certain populations occupy a liminal status vis-a-vis full inclusion into mainstream society and the benefits of full substantive citizenship, and can therefore be easily disregarded or disposed of. So today I'm introducing suspect citizenship as a framework for considering how certain populations, by virtue of their ethno-racial assignment by others, have been rendered forever marginalized and incapable of being included into society. I use visible minorities' understanding and experiences of state violence and how they mobilize against it to understand how the suspect citizenship is both constructed and resisted. And so therefore, this 2005 moment, or critical juncture, as I'll shortly discuss, was not the only or most recent example of state violence in France. It was also neither at the beginning nor end of the construction of suspect citizenship, as state violence stems from France's colonial histories in much of the Maghreb, West Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, and persists in this present post-colonial or neocolonial moment. I argue that suspect citizenship matters as a way to make sense of how colonial and racial logics persist in the post-colonial period. I demonstrate, therefore, that state violence is not just a question of race, it is also a question of citizenship. Who can belong and who is permanently excluded from ever belonging. I present suspect citizenship as a more capacious way of understanding how difference in hierarchies are maintained following the end of formal colonial rule. And here I'm using the term visible minorities throughout this talk, which is a French social science term used to refer to ethno-racial minorities in a seemingly colorblind context. I will next discuss my methods and provide a background on French republicanism, racism, and citizenship, which situates this work. I will then introduce my framework of suspect citizenship and provide some examples from my framework of how it both manifests and is resisted by visible minorities, as evidence in their experiences of and mobilization against state violence. I conclude with the implications of this framework, why suspect citizenship matters, both within and beyond France. And this image here is of a mural of Adama Traoré, who I'll talk about shortly, and George Floyd in Saint-Denis, banlieue just north of Paris in 2020. And this is a Getty Images photo, so not my photo. So my book here is based on ethnographic research in the Parisian metropolitan region conducted between 2017 and 2022. This includes 47 interviews with activists involved, broadly speaking, in mobilization against police violence, including individuals who are associated with different collectives or organizations, as well as journalists who've reported on some of these issues, and family members and friends of victims of police violence, some of whom are activists themselves. I've also conducted many, many hours of participant observation over this time period with different organizations at demonstrations related to police violence and anti-racism, as well as organizational meetings, activist trainings, and other types of related events. Most of the people I engage with in my fieldwork are visible minorities, mainly either Maghreb, West African origin, or Caribbean origin, as in descendants of migrants from former French colonies and present overseas départements in these regions. I've connected with individuals through various collectives and organizations, existing networks, social media pages, which I'm happy to say more about during the Q&A. I do all this work in French and then use a native French transcriber, and then I do the translations myself. So my method here is informed by a Black feminist epistemology, which among other things takes seriously my standpoint as a Black woman conducting this research. In some of my earlier work, I've discussed how my identity as non-French and as a Black US citizen has been implicated in conducting ethnographic research, namely in my relations with my respondents, some of whom perceived an insider connection with me as a fellow ethnoracial minority. This is also true with what I'm going to share with you today, particularly as individuals reference my own identity or their perception thereof as a Black American living in this era of increased attention to police violence against Black Americans, and of course to the growing Black Lives Matter movement. I'm continually fascinated by how the connections my interlocutors make and the boundaries they draw vis-a-vis my identity or their perceptions thereof further reveal how racism is understood in French society. And this is a photo I took at a 2018 demonstration for Adama Traoré, who was killed by the police in 2016. And I also just want to note that unless I say otherwise, I took the majority of the photos in this talk, which I also see as part of this ethnographic method. So why France? Is a question I get often. So France is a fascinating site to explore the liminality and complexities of citizenship, inclusion and exclusion, and belonging and non-belonging, because of its model of citizenship based on its Republican ideology, which does not recognize identity-based categorization. So the only meaningful and legitimate identity in France is being French. France emphasizes the connections among citizens over any other characteristic or categorization. Distinctions based on group identities are ostensibly not made or allowed. Race is not even seen as legitimate or quote unquote real. It is not measured in the census or elsewhere in government. And in fact, acknowledging race is itself seen to perpetuate racism. France therefore imagines and continually constructs itself as colorblind or race neutral. Yet despite the Republican emphasis on the renunciation of ethnoracial categorizations, many scholars, including some people in this room, here I'm thinking about Sue Peabody, Todd Shepard, and Jennifer Baton, among others, have argued that France has long relied on ethnoracial boundaries in constructing its national identity. Race has operated and still operates as a basis of differentiation within France. Here I find Aimé Wynot's framework of the racial project to be instructive, as this framework allows me to consider how people are marked as different and inferior without state-level categorization. It also helps to explain the creation and maintenance of a quote-unquote racial common sense, in which individuals are marked as distinct in the absence of state categories, yet those distinctions come to have very meaningful consequences. So given its long history of colonial slavery, colonialism, and related subsequent migration to the metropole, France is a crucial site for understanding how individuals who are descendants of imperial and colonial structures fare in a post-colonial context, as well as how states, quote unquote, manage descendants of formerly colonized subjects, excuse me. Relatedly, while anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon, France provides a site for understanding its continuities both during and following colonial rule, and for how colonial logics of inherent inferiority and dehumanization get expressed in a post-colonial context. For example, Franz Fanon wrote of how the European has a fixed concept of the Negro, and therefore how Blacks in France are not seen as of France. This is an example of what David Theo Goldberg terms as quote unquote racial Europeanization, of how race is seen as a problem everywhere but in Europe, whereas instead often framed as exceptional or related to phenomena of the past, such as the Holocaust, as well as to the general ways that European identity is constructed as synonymous with being white, so that not being white marks one as not being part of Europe. And this photo here is from a protest in 2018, and hopefully you recognize the image of Rosa Parks. And the text translates to, "Who will protect us from the police? Police are everywhere and justice is nowhere." So my framework of suspect citizenship builds upon questions I've explored in some of my earlier work, including the framework of citizen outsiders, which itself builds upon Black feminist scholarship, conceptualizing how individuals can be members of a society in a formal sense, yet simultaneously kept on the margins of that society, thereby complicating the relationship between race, citizenship, and belonging, as well as the framework of cultural citizenship, which I've used previously as a corrective to theories of immigrant incorporation and assimilation for the second generation. So here I'm examining suspect citizenship at the nexus between boundaries of belonging and non-belonging in society, anti-racism, and activism against state violence or police violence in France. So my use of citizenship in suspect citizenship builds upon long-standing debates on the racialized and differential nature of modern citizenship, thinking here of scholars such as Gurminder Brahma, Letty Volpe, David Fitzgerald, and Evelyn Knocknell Glenn, among others. I push this. I don't know if it's an alarm screen, but thank you. I push this further by questioning whether or not ethnoracial minorities are ever kept capable of being fully included into society. My I don't know if it was like a fire alarm or something.
That's all good. Okay. We're safe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, thank you so much for doing that. My use of suspect in suspect citizenship builds upon extant research on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism and how Muslims are increasingly surveilled and constructed as quote unquote suspect communities, as for example, Francesco Ragazzi has shown in his work. Yet I extend this by arguing that this ongoing construction of suspicion is broader than counterterrorism in Muslim communities. Rather, it is constructed against and resisted by non-white populations. Suspect citizenship is another way of considering how non-belonging is produced. Here I'm building off the work of Anna Korteweg, Gorchi Virkadel, among others, as well as the precariousness and liminality of full societal belonging. In this way, I suggest that visible minorities in France are quote unquote permanent minorities, per Maoud Madami's framework, who has argued that colonial modernity led to the making of permanent minorities in modern nation states, and quote unquote permanent strangers, per Stephen Small, who has argued that Black people throughout Europe must wear their passports on their faces. In this way, suspect citizenship also clarifies the relationship between non-belonging and anti-Blackness, as I demonstrate how they are co-created and co-produced. I present an empirically produced theory of the production of non-belonging and its relationship to whiteness and white supremacy. I demonstrate how suspicion is constructed and attached to specific populations and how these populations make sense of, mobilize against, and resist this construction. This is a suspicion that locates them on the margins of mainstream society and renders their incorporation and inclusion as impossible. Therefore, I'm arguing that it is not one's legal citizenship status that marks boundaries of inclusion and belonging, but rather one's construction as suspect. So I now want to say a few words about the contours of state violence in France as I'm conceiving it for this project. So anthropologist Didier Fasson has argued that the police acts as an agent of the state to maintain ethnoracial boundaries in the absence of state-level categories. In other words, the police enact the real and symbolic violence of the state, or do its quote-unquote violence work, as Magneta Teher terms it. Here I'm deliberately using the term state violence, not just to refer to specific killings by the police, but also as a way to understand the different ways that the state, including through the police, is involved in the systematic devaluing of certain individuals across various domains of society. In doing so, I rely upon Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism as quote unquote the state sanctioned or extra legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Such a definition helps to clarify the relationship between ethno-racial assignment, the state, and the violence it enacts. Anthropologist Paul Silverstein has argued that these contrôle d'identité or identity checks by the police, such as what Zayed and Boda experienced before their deaths, are a kind of citizenship surveillance of predominantly Black and Maghreb-origin individuals. Political scientists Fabian Jobar and Renee Leve have demonstrated how they disproportionately target visible minorities. A 2012 Human Rights Watch report found the majority of Black and Maghreb-origin individuals reported identity checks by the police as a major problem. They are 6 to 8 times more likely than whites to experience them. As to actual deaths by the police, estimates vary, but one estimate by Bastamag, an independent French media source, states that between 1977 and 2022, about 861 people died at the hands of the police. By focusing beyond specific incidents of state violence to examining the specter of state violence, I'm interested in the work that state violence does within a society. It conditions certain populations to be suspect or forever on the margins of that society. In other words, the raw numbers or statistics of police brutality only tell part of the story. Considering state violence in a broader scope reveals how it is not exceptional, but rather part of a broader structural condition in which profiling, surveillance are normalized and quotidian. So what does anti-racist mobilization and anti-racism look like in a context in which race does not quote unquote exist? How do visible minorities who are trying to make attention to hyper-surveillance and identity checks, as well as to actual deaths by the police, do so in a context where racism is never an accepted explanation for life chances and outcomes? How do people operate in the state of ongoing racialized crisis in the wake of French colonialism and the aftermath of decolonization? And this image is from a 2018 protest for Lin Jiang, who I'll also talk about shortly. And the French translates to the mean cop's assassin and the assassinate, and the nice ones just watch. So to contextualize this a bit, I'm going to provide 2 quick examples of the state violence and identity checks by the police. First, I'll talk about Safia, who was someone I met many years ago when I was doing research for my first book. So Safia is a 39-year-old journalist who is also a magazine editor and novelist. She was born in Paris to Tunisian immigrant parents and grew up with her 2 younger children, younger brother, and younger sister. She now lives in an apartment in Cergy-Pontoise, a western banlieue of Paris, with her 2 young children and her husband, who was born to Algerian immigrant parents and works as a baker. So one of the times when we were meeting in her office in the 15th arrondissement, she recounted a recent disturbing incident. So one day she traveled to Marseille in the south of France by train for some work-related meetings. She had no luggage with her, so she was not spending the night and is carrying only a satchel containing the items she needed for work. When her train arrived at Gare de Lyon in Paris at the end of the day, she was stopped leaving the train by a plainclothes police officer. He demanded to see what was inside her bag. She told me in my way that he addressed her using the informal or familiar pronoun tu for you rather than the formal vous, not merely a breach of etiquette, but also understood by Safia as a clear sign of disrespect. He demanded to see her identification and asked her why she was carrying only a satchel versus having luggage with her. He asked her, quote, "Are you smuggling drugs? Are you a prostitute? Are you working for someone?" Safia, humiliated, Safia answered that she was a journalist and had gone to Marseille for the meetings for that day. She showed him her ID and other identification issued by the publication for which she works. The craziest thing she told me as her eyes welled up with tears was that the train was packed with people, with white people. There were a ton of white people, and I was the only one who was stopped. No one said a thing. The other passengers just stared at me, end quote. She explained to me that she's seen things like this happen to far too many visible minorities in France. You can't just let these things go by, she said. How can people not think this is wrong? And this image is from another 2018 protest for Adama Traoré, and the French translates to halt to state murders and lies, and then justice for Adama Traoré. The second example of an identity check by the police is from the 2019 La Village Les Miserables, which I highly recommend. This film is an exploration of police-minority relations in a northern banlieue of Paris, which was also the setting of the 1862 Victor Hugo novel, hence the film's title. So this clip is a minute long, so I'm just going to play this in the
Bonjour, mademoiselle. Contrôle de police. C'est quoi, là?
Attends le bus.
Quoi?
On attend le bus.
Vous attendez le bus, là? C'est à toi, ça? À quel âge, toi? 15 ans? Et à 15 ans, tu fumes? Ça sent le shit, ça? Hein? Bon, il est où? Tu l'as mis où?
C'est pas grave,
Parce que tu l'as mis où?
c'est pas grave, je fais comme ça.
Non, ça, j'ai pas le droit. C'est l'état d'urgence. Si je veux, je te mets un doigt dans le cul, t'as compris?
C'est pas normal.
Ferme ta gueule, toi.
Vous n'avez pas le droit de faire ça.
Tu veux faire 48 heures?
Vous n'avez pas le droit de faire ça, vous n'avez pas le droit.
Eh, c'est bon. Ça va, je gère. T'as trouvé ça où? Tu veux que je continue à te palper ou pas? Tu fais quoi, là?
Je vous filme, vous n'avez pas le droit de faire ça.
Arrête de filmer.
Non.
T'es contente, là? Petite conne, va. Allez, dégagez, là. Faut arrêter de fumer, c'est mauvais pour la santé. Hein?
So one reason why I wanted to show this clip and again recommend this film is for how it addresses the sort of quotidianness of police harassment, which is also evident from the experience of Sophia I just shared. Moreover, throughout my fieldwork, many have made direct connections between ongoing practices of policing, harassment, and hypersurveillance with the same patterns and practices in former French colonies and present overseas departments. It reminded me that what I was studying and witnessing was therefore not a new phenomenon. They are therefore responding to a state violence that is not new, but rather an extension of the violence under French colonial rule. For example, historian Jennifer Baton has demonstrated how throughout France's empire and parts of Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, various colonized populations were labeled suspicious or undesirable by French officials, including when they migrated to the metropole, and decolonial and anti-colonial activists were heavily monitored and surveilled by the French police. One function of suspect citizenship is how it maintains its colonial continuities, including dictating which individuals are questioned, doubted, or distrusted. For example, Franco is a 47-year-old activist who was born in Guadeloupe and came to mainland France when he was 2 years old. When we first met at a small cafe near the movie theater Leal shopping center, he explained these continuities and how they relate to state violence. He said, quote, "What's happening now in France is reproducing what happened in the colonies. Postcolonialism is just a myth. What we have now is neocolonialism. Nothing has changed as the ideas are the same. This is a bigger problem than just police violence. It is part of neocolonialism. Police violence is just a symptom of what really hurts people. We have to fight against what's in people's heads, what never left. We have to decolonize our minds. It's the only way towards the total liberation of Black people," end quote. So Franco grew up in various banlieues surrounding Paris and is active with a number of collectives fighting against police violence and harassment, as well as what he terms quote unquote Negrophobia. He was motivated to become an activist partly because of the 2005 uprisings. In another conversation, he explained to me that, quote, "We're the only ones ever called racaille or scum, not the white protesters or people from the left," end quote. In fact, Franco is one of many of my interlocutors who mentioned how important the 2005 uprisings were for driving them to become activists, particularly as many of the conditions that led to the Zaid and Boda's deaths have not changed. In this way, we might see the 2005 uprisings as a critical juncture or a distinctive moment in which different ideologies and arrangements were forged, making it difficult to return to a period before such changes. So Franco often helps lead discussions for victims of state violence, including Adama Traore and Lamine Dieng, who I'll also talk about shortly, and also leads trainings to empower others about how to respond when they are stopped by the police, including their rights to film these encounters using their phones and then post those videos to social media. So in fall 2021, Franco was fined about 1,500 euros for spray painting a statue of Jean-Baptiste Colbert outside the National Assembly with red paint reading, quote unquote, state negrophobia in June 2020, which is the photo here that I took. Colbert famously wrote the Code Noir or Black Code, which defined slavery and its conditions in France's overseas territories. Franco publicly described this gesture, which was condemned by President Macron as an inappropriate way to protest, as a political act responding to the French state's anti-Black racism. Christian, who I first met at an anti-racist training in 2017, is a short, middle-aged Maghreb origin man who became active in this movement after his own 11-year-old son was killed by a flashball or a handheld projectile launcher used by the French police. He regularly speaks about state violence, exposing different policing techniques, and what he frames as the state's disregard for people like him. He and others resist state violence by appealing to French Republican values and indicting the state as a whole, yet they do so while also making claims to the state and to being French. He says, quote, we can't get justice from this justice system. We need to show force to show that this is intolerable. What's happening here is serious for a country with human rights. How can we say justice exists here when this happens? Every time you enter the public school in this country, you do so under the banner of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But it's clear that it does not apply to us. It never applies to us. We are all equal, end quote. When I first met Christian at this anti-racist training, he was speaking about the death of his son and screened a brief video of his son's final moments. He recounted how this video footage was manipulated in court to allege that his son had perpetuated his own attack. So here, Christian is speaking both to the permanence of his minority status and echoing what was constant throughout my fieldwork, how visible minorities feel France has failed to acknowledge and recognize all of its members. That Christian experiences not being equal reflects how he and others are interpolated as quote unquote suspicious to a French universalist society. State violence or the threat thereof is only one manifestation of the suspect's citizenship. Now I introduce Assa Traoré, who is leading the movement for justice for her brother, Adama Traoré. She's pictured here under a photo of her brother. So Adama Traoré was a 24-year-old Black construction worker who died after being arrested in a banlieue north of Paris in July 2016. The police first claimed that he had died of a heart attack and then later said he had had a severe infection. And there have been multiple explanations given ever since. Since his death, which one American media account termed quote unquote Francis Ferguson, there have been numerous demonstrations demanding justice for Adama Traoré, including one every year on the anniversary of his death. And this photo is from such demonstration in 2018. Assa and her family are alleging lack of assistance and willful neglect by the police as both contributing to his death, since he had chronic health issues prior to his death. Before her brother's death, she was working as a teacher's assistant in another banlieue north of Paris. She has since written or co-written 2 books, the sales of which she used to seek justice for her brother. This includes paying legal fees for 4 of her other brothers, she has 17 total siblings, who have been in jail for various periods since Adama's death. She has stated publicly that her family has been under attack by the state ever since they contested the official explanation for Adama's death, sort of explaining why her brothers have been arrested. Assa regularly gives talks about state violence and her brother's death, not just in France, but all over the world, and has received support from various celebrities, including French rapper Maccabi and activist and scholar Angela Davis. As she explained to me when we first met in 2017, she sees this cause as not just about justice for her own brother, but for all forgotten populations in France, including residents of the quartier populaire or working class neighborhoods, who know the police only as a quote unquote invading force. Here's one example from my fieldwork of how activists frame and understand state violence as not just about specific killings, but rather as an indicator of how visible minorities are systematically devalued. Once when I met with her when she was signing copies of her first book at the offices of Soul, her publisher in Paris, she explained, quote, "We don't see people like Adama as a human, a son, a brother. Even I've been controlled in these quartiers, neighborhoods. What's happening in France is having an identity crisis. It wants to suppress differences, but you can't do that," end quote. Here, Assa is speaking not just to the pervasiveness of state violence, here the prevalence of identity checks, but also to the ways that people like her slain brother, like her, are not understood as part of France or even as fully human. Her words also speak to the tensions inherent in French republicanism, as some differences in French society are seen as meaningful and others are not. And this image is a photo I took at a 2019 demonstration for Adama Traoré, and it just says Black Lives Matter, but you can see at the bottom it says Silence France Kills, and then the date of Adama's death. So when I first met Asa, she had paid attention to incidents of police brutality in the United States and elsewhere, as well as to the growing Black Lives Matter movement. Yet this did not mean that she and other activists automatically transferred Black Lives Matter to the French context, as they are aware of the differences in structure and identity politics between the two societies, even if the experiences of ethnoracial minorities can be similar. As she explained to me at the time, she said, quote, Black Lives Matter is difficult to do here. You can't even say the word noir. And all these issues are related, undocumented immigration, et cetera. So we can't have a subcategory of Blacks. We can't say that undocumented immigrants are not ours, that they are not related, end quote. So I highlight Asa's understanding of Black Lives Matter here to illustrate that people can relate to Black Lives Matter in the United States and incidents of state violence against Black Americans while also critiquing the movement in the States. And this photo here is from a community event sponsored by Ferguson in Paris, which is an anti-racist collectif in France that, among other things, connects incidents of state violence in France with incidents of state violence against Black Americans. And these two individuals are actually African-American activists from St. Louis who came to Paris to discuss their experiences being involved in various protests following, in Ferguson, Missouri, following the death of Michael Brown in 2014. Yet especially since the 2020 death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests and demonstrations throughout much of Europe, Asa has become a face, if not the face, of France's present anti-racist movement, and has been framed as such in French, US, and other international media. For example, Asa led a massive demonstration outside the High Court in Paris of more than 20,000 protesters against police violence, including the death of her own brother, Adama, and Floyd's murder, as this media image shows. Several protest signs invoked Black Lives Matter and, quote unquote, I can't breathe, the last words of both George Floyd and Adama Traoré. In a later interview with the French magazine Antidote, she says, quote, when George Floyd died, that's our brother. They, Floyd and Traoré, died the same way. I recognize myself in Black Lives Matter. We are all Black Lives Matter. Our common issue is racial discrimination. Here as over there, it is the Blacks, the non-whites, who are being killed, end quote. So considering this shift, I suggest we should not assume a quote unquote natural resonance or automatic connection with Black Lives Matter, but more importantly, pay attention to the nuances and intentions by which visible minorities pay attention to incidents of state violence in the US as well as elsewhere, but also have their own critiques about movement ideology and tactics. So they are not parroting whatever comes out of the United States, but rather considering strategically what it means to do so. And I think Asa's anti-racist work, both within and outside of France, speaks to this tension. So in considering how visible minorities challenge and resist their suspect citizenship, it is necessary to consider both the local specificities and how they struggle beyond nation-state borders. As the example of Asa illustrates, women are often the faces of this movement against state violence as they mobilize on behalf of their brothers, sons, and other male relatives as victims of state violence. In doing so, they leverage their standpoint as Black women and women of color more generally to demonstrate how state violence is both a racial and gendered phenomenon. This is part of a global history of Black women as central to movements for Black liberation more broadly. It is therefore useful to employ an intersectional perspective to the dimensions and structures of suspect citizenship. And this image is from Ferguson in Paris, the anti-racist collective I just mentioned. And pictured left to right are Ramada Dieng, who I'll discuss next, Amel Bantouzi, whose brother Ami was killed by the police in 2012, and Asa, who I just discussed. And then on Asa's sign are all are names of other victims of state violence in France. So here I introduce 45-year-old Ramada Dieng, who I also first met in 2017. So on June 17, 2007, her brother Lamine Dieng, a 25-year-old of Senegalese origin, died following a struggle with multiple police officers in Paris's 20th arrondissement, not too far from the Père Lachaise cemetery. Lamine was restrained face down on the street with his hands tied behind his back and his feet strapped together. He was then taken to a police van, and by the time he arrived at the police station, he was no longer breathing. The medical report stated that he died of asphyxiation. Yet his friends and family want a full investigation as well as punishment for the officers involved. And this is a photo of a demonstration she led in 2018. So after her brother's death, Ramada started a collectif de volée, or loosely translated as stolen lives, as a way to mobilize others against state violence. She wants us to be a worldwide network connecting what's happening in France with what's happening in the United States and globally. Through this collective, she and other activists align with friends and family members of other victims of police violence and also hold yearly commemorative demonstrations on each June on the anniversary of Lemin's death. During this commemorative march, Ramada recounts the specific events leading to the death of her brother, leaves flowers at the exact spot where he died, as well as allows family members and friends of other victims of state violence to give their own testimonies. And this photo is from a demonstration I was a part of in July 2017 for what was then the 10-year anniversary of Lemin's death. Once when she and I were meeting in a park, not too far from where her brother died, she explained the contours of this issue. She said, quote, "Police violence in France really is a racial question. It is racism of the state. Because when you look at the list of victims, essentially more than 90% are Blacks and Arabs. The remaining 10% are activists or militants, Roma, and what we say in quotation marks is accidents. Whites only die by accident because they are not targeted, they are not the profile. There's a kind of profile for police violence, and the profile of victims is always the same profile. It's always young Black men between 20 and 40 years old, and Maghreben as well, between 20 and 40 years old," end quote. So Ramada also sees being a woman as an asset in this struggle, as women are also subjected to identity checks like men, as evident in the clip I showed earlier. And she sees her brother as an example of any Black or Maghreben man in France that this could happen to. And later in that same conversation, she told me that in the United States, state violence is much worse as there are many more victims. Yes, she said, quote, "This happens in all Western countries because it comes from the state. The state is racist," end quote. This is one example of how visible minorities understand state violence as a looming presence and threat. And during the same meeting with Ramada, she noted how frequently the same police officers were coming to the park where we were hanging out, harassing the same youth they had spoken to only an hour or two beforehand, speaking both to the quotidianness of police harassment and the social function it actually plays. And this image is from a poster for advertising the 2015 demonstration for Lemin Yang. And then hopefully can recognize the references to Ferguson, Detroit, and Baltimore, all places with sort of quote unquote high profile incidents of police violence against Black Americans. And then the translation of the image of Malcolm X, hopefully I don't have to explain who that is, but and then the translation is our objective is total freedom, total justice, total equality by any means necessary. And the second quote is truth is on the side of the oppressed. So Anya and I argue that we are quote unquote compelled to think racially, meaning that in order to oppose racism, we must first acknowledge race. Racism is evident in practices and discourses of state violence, which creates and reinforces state suspect citizenship. The state activates racial boundaries through incidents such as the deaths of Zaid or Bona or Lemin or Adama. Ethnoracial distinctions remain salient in French society, yet claims for recognition as French are forever thwarted in the face of these constraints. Struggles against state violence have to also be anti-racist struggles, even though there's no language to combat racism in France. So activists, for example, can connect their struggles with struggles elsewhere, but they're doing so in a context in which there are no legitimate, quote unquote, Black lives. And this is a photo I took at a banner for the 29 demonstration for Adama Traoré, and the names are all different victims of state violence, and the numbers are the ages at which they die. So to conclude, suspect citizenship as a framework matters because when we say French republicanism or France is inherently racist or white supremacist, we need to examine how that inherence is secured. I'm arguing here that suspect citizenship is how it's secured. In other words, certain populations are rendered forever suspect, and this structures belonging and non-belonging and how individuals resist that. The specter of state violence therefore structures the lives of visible minorities or non-white individuals in France, conditioning them as suspicious and forever marginalized. This is one example of what Charles Mills referred to as the quote-unquote racial contract, clarifying how white supremacy is maintained through distinctions between full and subordinate personhood. Suspect citizenship produces and reaffirms these boundaries of belonging and non-belonging and who can and cannot belong in society. And this is directly related to the European colonial project, which reordered and remapped much of the world, as well as to the simultaneous anti-Blackness and dismissal of racism throughout France and broader Europe. For example, as Celeste Currington argues in her own analysis of Afro-descendant women living in Portugal, she writes, quote, a larger ontological structure of anti-Blackness facilitates the racialized exclusion around belonging encountered by Black people day to day, end quote. In this way, the ongoing racial logics of difference forged under colonial rule provide a context for the use of state violence and police harassment in structuring and enforcing belonging versus non-belonging. I see suspect citizenship in line with recent calls for decolonial approaches to our ways of thinking as sociologists and in conversation with the expanding field of Black Europe, attending to how we cannot understand present dynamics in present-day Europe outside of our recognition of colonial and imperial histories, as well as the indispensable role of mobilization by Black populations against these structures presently and historically. In other words, documenting suspect citizenship is akin to presenting a history from below or a new way of thinking about and making sense of difference in postcolonial societies. As one of my interlocutors, Gregory explained to me, quote, racism is in France's esprit, minds have not been decolonized. Or as sociologist Stephen Small proclaimed, quote, we are here because you were there, end quote. I also think suspect citizenship matters with bringing this into conversation with Alba's distinction between bright versus blurred boundaries. I suggest here that the specter of state violence brightens boundaries between whites and non-whites. Moreover, a bright boundary exists between those individuals framed and understood as suspect and those who are not. State violence flattens distinctions between different visible minority groups, despite their different histories. This suggests that state violence and the growing mobilization against it suggests that a collective we is forming. I have demonstrated here how state violence and the threat thereof remind individuals of their status in society. The specter of state violence illustrates how citizenship and societal belonging extend beyond questions of legal citizenship status. Visible minorities rely on an idea of citizenship, hence here a Republican ideal thereof, to make claims both to the state and contest what the state enacts. Saïd and Boda were technically French. They were born in France, but simultaneous with this status was their status as suspect. Understanding the relationship between the two is crucial for understanding how racism operates and how white supremacy is maintained and enforced in plural and liberal societies. Suspect citizenship is a necessary feature of modern liberal societies, including but not limited to France, as some populations are automatically included within societies and other populations are treated as precarious and excluded from ancient society. This goes beyond inclusion into society into a consideration of whose entry and rightful place in society is actively denied. As sociologist Cecilia Minavar has introduced legal liminality to demonstrate the multivariate ways in bureaucratic systems that migrants face between being undocumented versus documented, here I suggest that suspect citizenship clarifies how this liminality and precariousness plays out even for legal citizens, as the state remains engaged in making people feel out of place. For example, in the context of the US, sociologist Barbara Combs uses the framework of quote unquote bodies out of place to convey how Black Americans are reinforced that they do not belong and experience quote unquote out of placeness by white Americans, whether when they call the police when Black Americans appear to be engaged in wrongdoing or when the police themselves enact violence upon Black Americans. This is a broader way of considering how Black populations are always outside of the category of substantive citizens, and therefore not entitled to the benefits of substantive citizenship. As Combs demonstrates the quotidianness of anti-Blackness in a post-civil rights movement context, I demonstrate here how this operates in a post-colonial context, as anti-Blackness and non-belonging are continually mapped onto colonial subjects and their descendants. France is therefore one case of society in which structures such as slavery and colonialism have changed, but underlying logics supporting them have not. Suspect citizenship offers a new way of considering ongoing practices of colonialism, following the end of formal colonial rule. I am ultimately arguing that we need a more expansive understanding of the relationship between citizenship, belonging, and race, and suspect citizenship help gets us there. So I will end coming back to Baldwin here he is pictured in Paris, as well as to this photo I took of a young boy with a t-shirt reading Black Lives Matter at a demonstration for Palestinian liberation at Place de la Nation in Paris, like a year ago, actually. So throughout my field work, from the dissertation research I began like 100 years ago to the current book that I'm sharing with you today, France's visible minorities have made clear the connections between their plight and the plight of Palestinians in the occupied territories. This is the context under which I conduct and share this research with you, and under which visible minorities struggle for recognition both in Palestine and globally. Beyond the context of France, Baldwin has long warned us of the dangers that will occur when white supremacy, or this quote unquote racial nightmare, as he put it himself in 1963, is not contested, challenged, or rebuked. It will be the fire next time. Thank you.